let's start with what preceded that, because it wasn't on at first blush that there was, particularly you writing about anti-Chinese sentiment. Tell us
Mhm.
about the context of that.
Yeah, so the Chinese in America first started coming in large numbers in 18 after the 1848 discovery of gold in California at Sutter Creek. Um, and they really started coming 1849, 1850, 1851. You could see the numbers starting to go up. And initially, there was actually the reception was kind of curious and generally welcoming. I mean, not exclusively. You find articles, some of them I quote in my piece from newspapers at the time, sort of describing the Chinese as kind of quiet and industrious and just admirable sort of people to have in this country. The railroad worker, the railroad executives who came to rely on Chinese workers to build the Transcontinental Railroad were, effusive about the work ethic of Chinese workers. And but there were definitely moments where in the frontier, this is what this was, the American West, where miners were running off Chinese from their claims and driving them out. And there were just kind of episodic episodes of violence. But it really started to accelerate and rise in the 1870s when the country went through its first really major depression. And this was a period when a lot of workers from out east were starting to migrate west. There were a lot of workers from the Transcontinental Railroad that was done. That project was done. They needed work, and there was competition for jobs. And things really started to accelerate at that point, and it coalesced into a national movement.
What was there any? I mean, do you have a sense of? And this may be outside of the portfolio; it's outside of the piece. But because at one point I know that that some of the hate, if you will, or the bias towards Chinese was um, uh, was expressed as, I see the terms Asiatic being brought up, and but were there other nationalities from
Mm.
greater Asia that had a significant
Mhm.
presence, at least out west?
Uh, Not in the mid 1800s, but it's not mentioned in the piece. But Japanese immigrants started to become a larger contingent late 1800s, early 1900s, and the Chinese Exclusion Act passed in 1882, and there were some successive sort of measures to really clamp down on immigration from China. And once that was established, and the same forces started to look at Japan and Japanese immigrants. And this isn't in the piece, but it kind of got too large in scope. But um, this was the period of yellow peril. It started in Europe. Kaiser Wilhelm actually started to talk in Europe about a need to sort of establish kind of a European American sort of alliance against the threat of Japan. And and so in 1924, we shut down, America shut down through legislation immigration from Asia completely and or largely, and Japanese were really the target of this, as well as that same legislation was what shut down most immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe. This is tied up in the eugenics and sort of nativist forces that were happening in the 1900s, early 1900s.
It's fascinating, and I want to make sure that we sort of go through this because the trajectory is also fascinating because you see the development of this, and part of it is this economic anxiety and looking around for the first person you can blame. How much did before we get to that, how much did what was the fights about slavery and about the expansion of the West prior to the Civil War, how much did that play in? Like, what role did the Chinese play in just being there for labor purposes? Uh,
Hmm.
and then how did that
Yeah.
role change after the Civil War when that stuff wasn't necessarily on the table in the same way?
Well, the anti-Chinese sentiment was very much tied up in uh, labor issues. Um, there was, I don't think this is exactly what you're asking about, but there was a lot of organizing against railroad executives and other executives, executives running mines and that kind of thing. In fact, like the Rock Springs, Wyoming massacre, which is one of the worst atrocities committed against Chinese immigrants in the Wyoming territory. Um, this was in the 1880s. The triggering event what related to some labor unrest, and the Chinese weren't willing to strike, and that led to tensions between white workers and Chinese workers in these mines. The thing that you the one thing that you mentioned about the Civil War and Reconstruction that is interesting is and I didn't know all this, is actually the reason some of the Western states opposed some of the amendments, the Reconstruction Amendments, 14th, 15th Amendment, actually didn't have to do with slavery, but it had to do with, or the rights of formerly enslaved blacks, but Chinese. And that was the reason why some Western states opposed some of these amendments. It's just fascinating history.
Well, I mean, specifically, and what I also learned from your piece was that the I guess the edifying or the development of the
Birthright citizenship.
right citizenship was a function of a Chinese man in his early 20s, Wong Kim
Mhm.
Ark. Uh,
Yeah.
why don't you tell us that story? Because I had no idea that it was that this is the case that had sort of, I guess, filled out the contours of birthright citizenship.
Yeah, so not there isn't that much known about Wong Kim Ark himself, but it's a landmark case from 1898. He was this was this period of China's exclusion, when you laborers from China were not allowed entry, but there were certain people who were allowed entry. If you had a reentry certificate, they started to clamp down on that. If you could prove you were a merchant, if you could prove that you were, uh, um, you had a right to of residency or entry. And Wong Kim Ark was born in the United States, and this was during this period when there were a lot of things about naturalization and citizenship that were up in the air. Um, Remember, there was a law from 1790 that governed our naturalization process that said that non-white people were not eligible, and that was a big sort of a discussion point um, in the latter half of the 19th century as well. And so this um, obviously the 14th Amendment essentially codified that that citizenship was available if you were born in the United States, and Wong Kim Ark sort of secured that precedent of here was a person of Chinese descent, non-white, who was born in the United States, and the Supreme Court agreed that he was an American citizen, and that obviously has huge implications for today.
Hi, I'm Sam Seder. You can watch the rest of this interview and more on our Peacock show, which streams at 5 p.m. weekdays on The Choice from Peacock TV.